the best way to understand a person's reality today is to understand that sometimes we view the present through the lens of the past. There are things that trigger us today that remind us of the past. In some cases, it's nostalgia. It's longing for something that we loved in the past and we're looking back for. But sometimes it's toxic. It's something that triggered today that reminds you of a past battle that you fought and waged, and you really don't want to go through it again. So when I'm talking to somebody new, I'm always listening for those cues through the stories they tell me of what's in their story that's meaningful, that helps me connect with them better.
I love finding those connections. And my kids always laugh because when we travel, strangers will tell me some of the oddest stories and they're like, whoa, why did they share that with you? And I'm like, because I listen and I'm curious. The triggers stands out to me because I did this anti-racism program with Leadership Greater Washington. And it was a 6-month period and then a 3-month, and then we have a follow-on coming in January. And it's fascinating. But our group, our study pod, decided to take one of the resources, My Grandmother's Hand. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Resma, yes. He's fabulous because he talks to white bodies, white people, blue bodies, police, and black bodies, people of color. And he takes you on a journey of going back and looking at your stories, which is what we just talked about, and recognizing some is nostalgia, but there's a lot of trauma there. And even when we don't feel that, but that we can understand that. And when you listen and hear where someone else is coming from, there's like this aha moment of, oh, no wonder what I said triggered them in a weird way or an uncomfortable way. So yes. We have to resolve that part first, he says.
Absolutely. And for your viewers, that book is phenomenal. So I hope you'll put it up for people to see. And one of the lessons that I've really learned deeply is that I won't use the institution, but I was at an institution where there were very talented people from all over the world, highly intelligent. But I was surprised when I became sort of a person who was in charge of an a dorm way. So I was a tutor. That, Melissa, there are a lot of functionally dysfunctional people. On the surface, they're brilliant. They look like they have it all together, but there's trauma underneath the surface. And in that role, the power that I had is I knew those stories and I knew the trauma. What I think the George Floyd moment is there were a lot of African Americans who were functional on the surface, but were deeply wounded by stories that the rest of the world didn't hear. And that's so important to remember, is that when you're talking to somebody, you really can't judge a book by its cover. You need new tools to figure out, how do I create a safe space? And you don't want to re-traumatize a person, right? So how do you connect with folks in ways that don't re-traumatize them while also honoring the entirety of the human being? That's a skill that I think is becoming more difficult over time.
You said earlier it took the Quakers 100 years. Well, if you think about it, slavery, 200 years in this country? So 300. So how long will it take to undo that trauma and that pain?
But it's the willingness to forge a recognition that the narratives we've told ourselves as Americans are made up narratives that were based on ego. And this is why I go back to that concept of ego. So I know we don't want to get into a debate on critical race theory, but one of the things that I think is so fascinating in this country, Melissa, is that there are people who have retreated to their camps on all sides. But at the end of the day, there's an insecurity about having a narrative that you believed all your life be blown up. I can't tell you the number of friends I've had who are white, who are like, I had no idea this was going down. I had no idea that your experience perhaps mirrored closer to George Floyd's than I would have anticipated. So I think what you have is a shattering of the narrative and the identity that people have been built and fed. Now, instead of acting with fear and anger and going into bunkers, let's reforge the identity. Let's figure out together what we can share and what that identity could look like. But that means you got to put this ego aside and you got to push through it to be able to have those conversations and be open to an identity that, perhaps is a new narrative for you.